welcome back. 3 Candid Questions is here with season 2. How exciting! I had a super great time with Shelly, whom I interviewed for episode 1, and we spoke about a super insightful and interesting topic, and that is communication, the whole package, like body language, but also words in the corporate world. How does it influence how you can climb the ladder, what success you have in the corporate world, and especially for women? But of course, this conversation is also interesting for men because she spoke a lot about the differences, like how women are perceived in the corporate world, how men are perceived in the corporate world, and why some communication tricks are very important for women to learn, but also what men sometimes have to keep in mind in the corporate world. So like, subscribe, share, tell us your stories, your experiences, engage as much as possible with this podcast so that lots of people can benefit from season 2, which again will bring you super interesting stories from around the world with very interesting people across the globe. So stay tuned. And there we are. Hi, Shelly.
Hi.
So awesome to have you here on episode 1 of season 2. I'm so excited.
It's exciting.
So really very exciting. So thanks for making the time. And as always, I'm super excited to find out where our conversation takes us today. But before we jump into that, just let the audience know who you are and what you do at the moment, the main focus areas.
Yeah, so my name is Shelly O'Donovan, and I own a company called the Authentic Influence Group. We primarily go in and train in medical device companies and also pharmaceuticals. Sometimes we do other companies as well. And teach them all the tricks and tips for body language and visibility in the workplace and really moving up that corporate ladder, because sometimes the corporate ladder can be a really tough place and you need someone in your back pocket to just kind of help you. So I go in and train teams, and then I also have some one-on-one clients as well doing that same kind of work, just helping them. And my mission is really to get more women in those bigger roles, because I think we need more women at the table and leading the table.
Yeah, super interesting. So the topic of body language or communication and so on is a big topic.
Yes.
And I think, obviously not just in the corporate world.
Yeah.
So what would you say are sort of the biggest focus areas that you usually find pop up when you go and train people?
Yeah, I think so. Body language itself and nonverbal communication is really huge. And I think it's something that's a little bit sexy. So people want to hear about it. They want to learn about it. And it's something that we don't think a lot about when we're learning communication. It's kind of an afterthought. And so that's something that I often train on. And then just you would be surprised by how many kind of bad communication things we've picked up over the years, especially with COVID, right? We all got locked down for a while. And so I have a lot of clients coming to me now just saying, like, I need to relearn this. I need to be more comfortable with people out in public again. And so there's a lot of that has to go on at this stage too.
Yeah. And from your experience, what's then the biggest challenge that people face?
Yeah, I think really the biggest challenge I think people face is just learning that all of those things, the communication and the body language and creating visibility in the workplace, all of that is a skill. And it just takes some time to learn, or sometimes unlearn things that you've done in the past. Because I think there's this fallacy out there that people that are good communicators just kind of pop out in life and they're like great communicators, and maybe they had the right parents or had the right experiences, but it's just not really true. You can learn, it's learned behavior, so you can learn it in a variety of places. And I think once folks understand that kind of unlocks the confidence for them too. It really cements that for individuals.
Yeah. So what I hear you also talk about a little is here, like what perception they have of themselves when they want to improve their communication skills, because
if you believe you're an introvert or you're not really good with people or with words, then I can imagine that it's much harder.
Yes. So absolutely. And that's where all of it starts, and just realizing that, everybody has moments. It's funny. I reported at one stage in pharma to a woman who was a rock star, right? She was really visible, really out there. She intimidated me a lot. And years later, after I had my company already, I interviewed her for something. And she said to me, every morning I go into the mirror and I say, Isabella, you've got this. You're going to have a great day. You're going to be strong. You're going to be brave. And I was just amazed in that moment to hear that someone who seemingly had it all together on the surface still had those moments of insecurity. And I think that that's one of the biggest takeaways that my clients often have, is that, it doesn't matter how high level you are, you still have those moments and you have to push through them. But if you can start to bridge them together and learn how to use specific communication skills to do that, it just unlocks a whole new world and a whole nother level of your potential, really.
Yeah. And are there some common tips or tricks that you usually teach your clients to overcome that fear?
Yeah. So the first thing is just, realizing that the fear is there, and it's kind of normal. And it depends a little bit on the situation you're in, right? If you're going into a meeting and you're going to present in a meeting, then there are things that we can do to kind of visualize beforehand. But just from a body language perspective in general, one of the biggest tips I have is just to keep your arms open and kind of keep your body open. And then if you're comfortable with it, also speaking with your hands, because hands are actually something we call trust indicators. So if I can't see your hands, and, let's say you have your hands in your pocket during the whole conversation that we're having, there's something in my brain that's triggered that just says, I don't really trust this person because I can't see their hands. And so it's something to keep an eye on. And not that you have to talk with your hands all the time, because some people just aren't wired that way, but at least having them visible so that someone can see your hands. And it comes back to when we were, cavemen, and we're looking to see, like, is somebody a friend or a foe, and do they have a weapon? And even though we're normally not looking for weapons, thank God, anymore, you still need to see those hands in order to kind of let down your guard and have some trust.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that usually a very open, body language definitely draws people in more than, when you close your body up and you come across very differently. And from your own life experience, how did you end up, training people in specifically this field? What made you be interested in it? And also what I'm interested in linked to that is, are there ever times when you, as an expert in this field, get freaked out, and what do you do in those situations?
Yeah. So great question. So it's really interesting. I've had a really incredible journey, I guess. I grew up in a working class family and got really interested in politics when I was probably a teenager, and decided to go to school and pursue a degree in political science. And then soon after that, I went into politics, just state politics, worked in 2 different state legislatures, and learned a lot of tips around influencing. So not just the communication hacks, but other things too, to really help. And so it was just really eye-opening working in politics. And one of those assignments was in healthcare. So I ended up kind of staffing a healthcare committee, and then eventually ended up going into healthcare in particular. And so working as a lobbyist for a big health system in the States, and then eventually going to GlaxoSmithKline and doing policy work for them and supporting their lobbyists and doing a lot of influencing things, really on behalf of the company, but also on behalf of patients. So we did a lot of work to support patients and to give patients access to medicines and vaccines. And so all of those things mixed together just started to give me this really firm foundation of influence and how to influence people. And then eventually I learned body language and left GSK and decided that, I wanted to teach people this, because as much as this is important for influencing like the political debate, it's so important for influencing like everything that you do. Like we don't realize how many touch points during the day we're influencing other people, or other people are influencing us and we don't even see it. We don't even notice that somebody's trying to push us in a certain direction. So it becomes just something that's really helpful in moving forward.
And were there ever times when you sort of questions, wow, like, you know, when you were wondering, is there a line that I need to draw between, you know, good influencing,
Yes.
positive influencing, negative influencing? I don't know how to call it best,
Yeah.
but you know.
There definitely is. And, you know, there's moments when we might try to frame something in a positive way or a negative way. And so you have to be careful of that. And I think that as long as you come at it with a really good intention in what you're doing, then it works. But all of these things can absolutely be used to manipulate somebody in a way that's not appropriate, or and so for me, I don't think that I would ever come at it from that direction, just because of who I am at my core. But there are certainly people who would, and people who do. So it's something you have to keep an eye on. But that's the other trick. Like once you learn some of these things, you can kind of pick up on when somebody's, you know, being honest and when they're not. And I teach lie detection as well. So, so I can definitely get a sense. And even if I taught you lie detection, I could only get you up to about 92%. So there's always that margin of error, but you can start to really uncover, you know, where there's truth and where there isn't. And that can help protect you as well.
That's very interesting. So can you give us an example of how you can detect a lie in someone?
Yeah. So it's actually a really deep process, but it works much like a lie detector test. So if you think about a lie detector, what it is doing, they hook you up to a machine and they're basically looking for changes in your body. So does your heart rate increase when I ask you a really tough question that you could be lying to me about? And they track all that. And that's how they get a sense of whether you're lying or not. And so that's the same thing that we do in lie detection. So it's really this idea of baselining somebody, asking them questions, sometimes asking them a question which might make them just a little nervous, but they wouldn't have a need to lie to you about it. And then from there, like seeing what changes are there and then noticing what change in behavior they had. So, and then there's things that liars do statistically more. So they're not always lying cues, but sometimes they can be. And once you start to see those cues together in a cluster, then you can start to get a sense that, okay, this person might be lying about this.
That's very interesting. So I'm thinking of maybe movements they do with their hands, or body language, or facial expressions that change.
Exactly. Like, for example, let's say we came on this interview and you started to ask me questions, and the whole time I had my arms crossed, and then you asked me something that you think is different and I might be lying about, then maybe the arms come open, or maybe the foot starts tapping, or maybe, you know, maybe I touch my nose a lot when you start asking something. So it depends a little bit on the person, and that's why you have to really baseline it. There's lots of articles out there that say if you look to the right, you're lying. If you look to the left, you're not. But that's not necessarily true for every person. It's really particular. That's why you have to really dig in. It takes a lot, and the best people for lie detection are those people who are really Pollyannas, right? They see the good in everything. Because they're always going to question, like, is that really a lie? Is that really a lie? And so that's why it works.
That's very interesting. So having all that knowledge about, you know, how people function and what they do you sometimes get sort of, you know, freaked out in certain situations? Is it hard for you as well, although you are such an expert? How does it feel for you?
Yeah, so sometimes I try to suspend it, you know, as much as I can. I'm not like constantly reading people in that way. but a lot of it, because I'm just so deep in it at this stage, a lot of it's become just really almost like an intuition. And so,
Yes.
so that's difficult. Sometimes I pick up things, I might see things I don't want to see. So I'll give you an example. I was going to a party one night, and I had been at an event earlier in the day. So I was dressed up, like overly dressed up for this party. And I walk in and I meet some people, and I just got some like weird glances from a couple of the women. And it just automatically made me feel like, oh, I wasn't like welcome there or something. And I think, you know, and I wouldn't have picked up on that had I not known body language, but I just, you know, got those cues. And so it's times like that it's really tricky. Or if someone reacts to you a certain way and you kind of realize, oh, like they didn't like that. You know, there's a moment of having to kind of be really humble in the moment and be like, okay, like I'm not going to let that like bother me. That might be, but you also never know. So if you were making, you know, angry, there's also something called micro expressions, and there are these intense moments that we have feelings and we'll make a quick micro expression, and it's involuntary for the most part. So it's really hard to fake. And it's also really hard to read because it happens so fast. And so, but if you made a angry micro expression right now at me after I gave you an answer, it might be what I said set you off, but it could also be that, you know, the dog walked in behind the camera or whatever, and you're like, oh, how am I going to deal with that? Right. So you never know unless you really start to ask more questions.
So what I can hear from that is also, and I think that's a very powerful point, the more we learn to read clues and, you know, understand what's going on around us with other human beings, and also how we can influence them, it's important to not do it with a negative or insecure mindset. Because, you know, when I have that mindset, I can hear you say, then that's when it can turn easily into something, oh, this person didn't like me, or this person is not happy with my answer, or whatever it is. And it might be something very different that is affecting them in the moment.
Yeah. And the problem is, if, let's say, you know, it was the dog that walked away, but I assumed it was my answer. And now all of a sudden I'm sitting here thinking, oh, like what, she didn't like my answer. Like, and that's going to change how I'm coming across to you as well, which is a problem and becomes a little bit of a negative loop. So you have to be very careful about that.
Yeah. Is that something you teach? You mentioned you are focusing on women also.
Yeah.
You teach them as well when you do this communications training?
I do. And I teach women a lot of just very specific, like body language things to open them up, to give them more space. Because if you think about men, typically men are just bigger in stature, so they take up more room naturally. And then you certainly have, you know, the alpha male who will take up even more room than that. And so, so I teach women how to take up a little more space. And that's one thing. And then also to realize that sometimes just because the alpha man walks in the room and starts to take up space doesn't necessarily have anything to do with her. It's just how they are approaching the world as well. And that's the other thing to always remember, that sometimes I might have, you know, a bigger than life personality, and it doesn't mean that the other person on the other end is, you know, any less whatever. It's just how I interact with the world, and not me personally, but I just mean anybody. So, you know, always thinking about, it's not always about you, and it might not always be about how somebody's connecting with you. It could sometimes be the person on the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another very important point there you bring up. I feel like not letting it project on ourselves all the time and feeling it's always about us, or us being inadequate or not alpha enough in that room. But it can also be, that's just how they approach the world, and now I find my way to approach the world. Yeah. And in terms of body language, when you compare how many men, let me use, you know, those stereotypical things now to make it a little smoother for us, men versus women, are there different things you need to teach them? apart from space?
Yeah, so space is a big one, and just however that manifests itself. So I'll give you an example. I was talking to a friend actually, and he was telling me, "Oh, we just had interviews here today, and we were interviewing people." And I was telling him that I was doing, work in body language now and everything. And he's like, "Oh, can I ask you? Because I had like a weird interview with somebody." And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Oh, I just walk in the room," and he's like, and I usually I cross my legs, like I'll put my heel over my knee and just kind of slouch back in the chair or come forward in it. And I was like, whoa, like that's like really aggressive, right? So it's something called the cowboy cross, when you would put, and mostly men do it. It's rare to see women do it. But they would kind of put their ankle over on top of their knee. So you almost make this cross patch. And so that's a really aggressive behavior. And as a woman, when you get that from a man initially, it's too much, right? It's like, whoa, like, and you might not even realize that. So that's one thing. And then, I'll tell women, take up more space. You can, other things you can do, or there are times in a conversation when you might want to lean forward and kind of come into somebody's like personal space. There's other times you want to be relaxed and kind of be more open. And so it just depends a little bit on how you want to be perceived and what your workplace is. And so that's some of the work that I do, is really talking to them about what's happening at work and what the different relationships are that they have to interact with every day, and how they negotiate those relationships so that they can get the best outcomes for their career.
Yeah, interesting. And on the flip side, how would it be perceived if a woman did it? Because you just said like this cowboy, style.
Yeah, so it depends a little bit, because especially in business cultures, there are places where in order to advance, you have to act the part. And often that part is a lot of bravado, so it's a really tricky place, because sometimes you do have to bring those things. I have seen women do the cowboy cross, and I think it's really interesting. I usually feel like, especially if somebody comes up to me and sits down and they do that, I'm like, oh, what's that about? Like, trying to overtake me for some reason. But
interesting.
Yeah. So it's just, you have to kind of really be looking at what happens. But once I started learning body language, I just thought it was so interesting, because I would walk into a room and people didn't even have to say anything, and I could get a sense of like who's in charge, like who's got some power, like what the dynamics were.
Yeah. But I can see that some of the body language, the same body language used by a man or a woman, can be then mean again something different depending with how we perceive males and females in that setting, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm just wondering, like, because you talk about all the bravado that is included in the corporate world, like, do you sometimes feel like, how do I put this? Like, oh, as women, instead of changing something, we sort of play into this whole, very masculine culture in the corporate, or what's your thought process there, your emotions?
Yeah, I do. And I think it depends a little bit on what the company culture is wherever you are. So I've definitely seen a shift in corporate culture recently to be more accepting, it's of kind of approaches that women would typically take more than men. And also just taking some of the language and things out. And there's certainly the diversity push right now as well. And so that's helping, at least in the US, that's helping to bridge some of this. And that's really important. But, I still have clients that tell me stories that I can't believe are happening in this day and age, just about, things being said, or these microaggressions, are just, in this day and age, this stuff is still coming forward. And so that's where body language and just even just learning how to influence in different ways in the workplace can be a really really important thing. And women in particular are very good, because we've had a different road to travel over the years. We're very good at finding other ways into things and other doors and back doors and that kind of stuff, to influence in a different way. It's just that we don't always get the credit that we deserve for doing those things, and that needs to change.
What do you think could be a way in terms of using our communication skills to change that then?
Yeah, I think, well, first and foremost, I mean, I push all my clients, and even if I just go out and give a talk, to really push back on things to the extent that they can. And listen, I understand that there are going to be moments in your career where somebody does something and you don't really have the power to push back on it. But in a moment, if you can do something to push back on that or to kind of educate the people around you, because often they don't even know. So I was at an event a few months back, and there was a CEO there, kind of a big shot in the area. And I happened to be hanging out with these communication folks that were kind of shepherding him around that day. And he said something about those girls over there. And now these were women that he was pointing to. And one of the communications folks that knew him pretty well just said to him, hey, Bob, like, it's, in some circles, that's like starting to be a little bit derogatory that you would call a woman a girl. So I just wanted to give you a heads up so that you don't offend somebody or step in it. Like, you could say it in front of me, but why don't you rein that in? And he actually took it with stride and was like, oh, okay. Like, I didn't realize that. So I think in those little moments, it seems like a small thing, but it's actually a big thing, because maybe he's not going to do that again. And maybe he'll have an epiphany that that's not right. And because all this stuff is constantly shifting, who knows, like, something we say now might in 5 years be totally inappropriate, right? So it's just always this learning process. But as women, if we can push back on that, if a man kind of overtakes us in a meeting, like pushing back and saying, no, wait a second, Joe, like, I need to finish making my point here, and then you can jump in. Like, that kind of stuff is really important. And I think we really undermine how important that is in changing things.
Yeah, it's almost like starting with the small things that you can do in the moment.
Exactly.
And by that, shifting it's like sending out ripples and shifting
Yes.
the bigger things with time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for those people who really feel like this is all very hard for me personally, are there like some simple practical tips you could give the audience, like, okay, this is what you can practice to feel a little more confident, or to get a little more into the flow of how you can use your body language and even your communication?
Yeah, I always say, like, just go on like a little journey for like a week or two and practice like one thing at a time. So maybe for the next, like, maybe if you're somebody who kind of always has your hands in your pockets or kind of closed off, maybe for the next week you just try to talk a little more with your arms open. And I always tell folks, practice in low stakes moments. Like, you don't want to do that when you're going in for like a job interview that you really, really want, because it's too much pressure. But maybe it's when you're going for a cup of coffee with a friend or something like that. And the other thing is to just record yourself. So if you were having conversation, much like ours with a friend, I would say just hit the record button on Zoom and see what you do. Go back and watch and say, what am I doing with my body? Is it open? Do I look like I'm talking to the person and really engaged, or do I look like I'm totally zoned out and not even paying attention? Because people tend to feel that. So that's the other thing, is really focusing on the other person rather than on you. So you want to have all those good body language skills, but you also just really want to be curious about the other person. And that is something that can just take you miles and miles and make people just become so attracted to you, because you are attracted to them, right? You're curious about them.
So apart from knowing all the pros and cons about certain things in body language and also verbal language. It's really about your energy. That's what I hear you say, because
absolutely.
when you are totally focused and you're curious and tuned into the other person, then you might get away with not doing everything like perfectly well, but they would just be drawn to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important, especially in this day and age, because I'm sure that you can reflect on a time when you met with somebody and they were like more interested in their phone, or they're kind of, looking at a screen, if you're out for a drink and they're looking at a screen that's like over the bar rather than focusing on you. But I guarantee if you sit and really focus on someone, they can feel that, and they just will hold more space with you as well. And so it's a really good way to connect with people. And it's a real game changer, because a lot of people aren't doing that right now. They're kind of checked out. And so it really makes such a big difference in how people perceive you.
Yeah, I think that's a super powerful tip. Like, it's really all about being curious and focusing on that conversation that you're having. Another thing that just popped into my head in terms of body language, but also the other forms of communication, and this day and age where many of us are in home office, or you're not always meeting in physical spaces, but more like we are meeting now. Is there something else that you would say is helpful in video meetings?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So definitely pushing your computer back a little bit so we can see your hands when you talk. That's important. And then the other thing is, to the extent that you can look at the camera itself when you're speaking to a group or something, that makes a difference too. It makes people feel like you're really looking at them. It's a little awkward though, because it's hard. Like, you're on my screen and I want to look at you, right? And so it takes a minute to kind of practice that, for sure. And so those are some things to do. The other tip I have is just to be careful about being on meeting after meeting over Zoom. So they've done research, and there are literally, like, after I think an hour, there are parts of your brain which literally shut down and don't fire up as much. So if you can even just put like 5 minutes between the next, like every hour, so that you're not constantly on that video, that actually will just give you more brain power to be able to focus.
Yeah, and then even, all the words come easier, and whatever point you want to make, your energy on camera, of course, will be different as well. Definitely. I find that extremely interesting, and I don't know what your experience there is, but I think in this day and age of social media and being on video calls all the time, it's so interesting that energy seems to travel across spaces. Even when we are not in the same room. I find that really fascinating, because sometimes when I have a call with someone who is very, energized, and you can actually feel the difference, even though they might be on a totally different continent. And
I find it interesting too. And it's interesting because I've heard different people say different things. So I find that I can feel that energy. But then I had a client who at one point, and this was when we were in complete lockdown, right? Nobody was going out. And she worked in an environment where there was just a lot of tension, like, on her team. And so they'd be in these meetings. And she said to me, it's helped because she didn't feel as much like of the tension when they were in the video call. So that there was like a moment of kind of, it's not here. And so I think, and I've thought a little bit about why that was for her. And I also think it's just a moment of taking the time, and her and I had talked about this, but if she was getting upset with something in the meeting, like how to kind of take control of that in the moment. And so part of that is grounding yourself and being like, I'm in my house, like the boss is not across the table from me. Like I'm, I've got space around me. But I also think that you're dead on with getting energy from other people through, through space and time. I don't know, but it's it's so interesting. It's really connected us in some ways, in ways that we probably wouldn't have had this conversation had COVID not happened, right? Because I don't know, Zoom wouldn't have been quite as, or video wouldn't have been quite as apropos anymore.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it is fascinating to see what has been made possible, and also the fact that you can feel so much despite the distance. But maybe it's also a little, that example you just gave with the lady who felt like, oh, now there's less tension. Maybe it's also what we want to experience through the video sometimes, maybe it was easier for her to draw a line with that space. But when she was right there, she didn't feel she could protect herself from all that tension that was coming right at her, because she felt there was no physical boundary. I think a lot is also like in our head in those moments.
Yeah, I think you're right on the mark with that. I think a lot of that is just drawing your own boundaries in your own spaces, and or letting it in, right? Letting the energy in when you want it there.
Yeah, yeah. And how can someone who feels that these things get to them so strongly, especially if it's at the workplace and they feel overwhelmed, or someone else seems to be taking all the space, how can you create your own space and not like let everything come to you so much?
Yeah, it's difficult. And I think especially if you're triggered like in the middle of something, that's when it gets even harder, right? Like maybe I didn't expect that this thing was going to happen, or this project was going to be brought up, and now all of a sudden, like, I got to deal with the fact that I'm angry and I'm sitting here. So one trick that I teach folks is just to use what you can in the room. So there's a part of your brain that kind of gets really angry, and that's like one piece of your brain. And then there's another part of your brain which is more analytical. So if you can give the analytical brain something to do, it turns off that angry part and calms it down. So one example I use is like looking at the wall and saying, what color is the wall? And asking yourself that really clear question, what color is that wall? Or how many, what time is it on the clock? Or just something really particular that's not hard to figure out, but that you have to think about, but you have to take a minute, take a breath, and literally train yourself to ask yourself that question in the moment. And it will calm you down, because now you've taken yourself away from that kind of brain that's just, angry and spinning.
Interesting. And then will the result be that because I've taken that emotion out for the moment or calmed it a little, that I can sort of continue to make my point and speak calmly in that meeting?
Yeah, usually it is. I mean, it depends how big that anger has gotten, right?
Yeah.
So, I had this happen once to me. I was in a meeting and somebody went somewhere I was just not expecting, and it took all I had to not like come through the screen, because it wasn't even an in-person meeting. And so I'm trying to like calm myself down, and those were the tricks I was doing. But it depends, right? So it depends a little bit on how, and the more you do it, the more practice you get for it. And you can also use this. It doesn't have to just be used like anger. It can be used with fear too. I was on a really bumpy flight over the summer going to Ireland, and I don't love to fly. I love to travel. I do not love to fly.
Yes.
And in the moment, I was just like, well, I have to deal with what's coming up because I can't get off the plane. So I used that trick. I was like counting counting rows of seats and counting, what color, how many people had red shirts on, and just trying to like calm myself down in the moment and take deep breaths. And so it can work in those situations too.
Yeah. It's almost like a form of meditation in a way, because you breathe, you focus on something so that your mind doesn't go like all over the place and your fear takes over.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested in, again, going back to, particularly supporting women in those settings. When they experience, let's say, anger or fear in those moments, but then also maybe caused by some statements or some things that they are not okay with. What would be the next step then after that? Should they, like, do you train them how to voice, their frustrations or whatever it is that they feel they need to say? Or what are those steps?
Yeah, the big thing is you first do want to calm down, because that's the other thing is women, I think we're always told like, oh, you're so emotional, like, and that can be the kiss of death, like in an office culture, right? So you have to kind of calm yourself down in the moment and then respond to whatever has been said or whatever you want to tackle. And like I said, it depends so much on kind of where you sit in the company sometimes, how you're perceived normally. Because sometimes unfortunately, in today's world, you can push back on something and it really affects the trajectory of like your career or your advancement at that company. That said, I always err on the side of pushing back, because I just feel like it has to be done. And so, so just calming yourself and then taking your points and trying to take the emotion out of it, and also speaking more from like a factual position. So if maybe my boss criticized me for something that I did wrong, instead of like being defensive with it, I might say, well, I understand that you have some concerns about this, but let me tell you the 5 things that we did do. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so that just takes the, and keep it very factual. Like, this is what we did, instead of defending like, oh, I didn't do that. You're kind of flipping it a little bit, and that'll give you a lot more credibility as well.
Yeah. I mean, and I feel that could even be translated to outside the office setting, when someone tells you something that they are maybe not okay with and you want to respond to that. It's never it doesn't help the situation to just become defensive. It always helps more to say like, okay, yes, I understand. Those are my thoughts about this, or, responding to it from that perspective. Or this is what happened in my, from my point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And even asking questions is sometimes putting people on the spot and saying that's a really interesting opinion that you have. Can you tell me more about that? Or can you tell me how you came to that opinion, or what? And that way you force them to explain themselves a little bit, without necessarily saying, I completely disagree with what you're saying. But so you're just kind of pushing them to think a little bit more, because unfortunately, sometimes people have really strong opinions on things and you're not going to change them, and you don't want to just spin in circles with them arguing about it. So the more questions you can ask and kind of get underneath it, it might actually help them to have an epiphany, and maybe, help you both to connect a little bit.
Yeah, because it also opens up the conversation rather than both parties just being, okay, this is my opinion, stuck with this. This is my opinion, stuck with mine. So absolutely. And I feel this kind of strategy or approach to a conversation almost feeds into influencing someone in a certain way.
Yeah.
So, because you ask questions and you might be able to open them up then to your point of view. What are other, like, maybe 1, 2 influencing tips that you have for people? Like, okay, this is how I want to make people feel, be drawn towards me maybe, or for me to reach a certain goal in a certain setting.
Yeah. So with influence, I think part of it is realizing that everyone has a certain amount of influence at any given time. And there are going to be times in your life or places in your life where you have lots of influence and it's really easy for you. And other places where it's just going to be difficult for whatever reason. It might be you, but it might be the situation. And so first kind of having that foundation, and then just thinking about, what do I want to get out of this situation, and how can I just get just a little bit out of it? So should I ask a little bit more? Should I, ask questions? Should I give someone something? There's also research that suggests if I give you something first, that you might feel like you owe me something, so you're going to give me something back. So, you have to be careful with that. But there's also research that says that if we break bread together, right, if we have lunch together, that actually builds the relationship a little more. So I think that in today's day and age, we just want to have like these transactional interactions with each other instead of really taking time to nurture a relationship. And that's any kind of relationship, right? That could be anything from a relationship with your friend to a coworker to a romantic relationship. But we need to take time to really nurture that. And so it's important to make those connections and just be willing to put the work in so that you can get there.
Yeah. So that means that in any human interaction, be it in the office setting or be it in another setting, it's actually important that I take it onto a certain human level.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, be it the lunch, be it a coffee, or a deeper conversation with someone with a little more, not just the chit chat about the transaction.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes time to do, right? Because you're not going to have a first conversation with somebody and then all of a sudden have them telling you their life story, So it takes time to get a little bit deeper with people. But once you do, then you can also really get a sense of what they need. And there's so many times in life that we're negotiating things and we think we're on different sides, but we actually want the same thing, or we want different things that can actually work really well together. And so that's something to keep in mind too. It's not always about what it seems to be about at the surface. There's often something else a little bit deeper, and you have to start to uncover that. And that takes time.
Yeah. So really being willing to invest in the human connection there that you can build when you spend a little more time with someone. Yeah, awesome. Don't know, do you have some like final best
some
body language or communication tip?
Yeah, so one thing I like to stress is just the fact that communication is not a one-way process. So it's a two-way street at least. And sometimes obviously there's more than two people in that communication. So really knowing what that other person needs and what they want and how you can approach that, how they like to be communicated to. Certainly if it's somebody that you're working with or a friend, they might like to text all the time, but you might like to talk on the phone. Like what works for that particular thing. And then just from a body language perspective, keep the arms open, try to have a positive face when you can in certain situations, and use the hands if you can to talk as well. And also whatever you can do to build eye contact is important too. And so there's research that suggests when we look at somebody in the eyes, that builds oxytocin, which is this connection hormone, which is what makes you feel connected to people. And so even if you and I were having a phone call, if I pulled up your picture while we were having that call and I looked at your picture, that's actually going to build oxytocin on my side, and you're going to hear that in my voice. So you're going to hear that I'm connecting better to you. It's going to feel like we're actually better connected.
That's super interesting. And it goes back to this whole thinking of energy and how it travels through space and time, like anyway.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I must honestly say that I enjoy video calls much more than
me too.
Calls where I don't see the person. And that might be a reason, because I like to feel the connection, really.
Yeah. And on a phone call, it's really easy to not pay attention, right?
Yeah.
And people think all the time, like, oh, if I just pull up this website and look at it while I'm talking, nobody's going to notice. But I can hear that in your voice, right? That you're not paying attention to me. So it really comes across quickly.
So again, our number one tip, be very focused on the person and be curious and fully in the conversation, not busy with anything else.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Shelly, for making the time, for sharing, all these little stories and the tips that you have.
Yeah.
And let's see what our lovely audience takes away from it and how they will communicate in the future. Please share, audience, share your thoughts, share your questions. You can reach out to Shelly, of course. Is there any way you would love to be contacted?
Yeah, so you can certainly go to my website, which is AuthenticInfluenceGroup.com. But the other place is LinkedIn. I put out a lot of videos. You've probably seen some of those at this stage. And so that's a great place to connect and to get some tips on a daily basis. So feel free to connect with me or follow me, whatever you want to do out there.
Awesome.
This was my conversation with Shelly, episode 1 of 3 Candid Questions, season 2. I hope you enjoyed. Give us a lot of love, share, comment, subscribe, like, share your experiences. What are your thoughts on what Shelly had to share about communication, about the corporate world, about women and men climbing the ladder? What did you take away from this episode? And stay tuned for episode 2, where I'm going to interview a wonderful, wonderful life coach, and she is going to share her super broad wisdom on how to move past pain, trauma, how to build healthy relationships, how to grow your own awareness. So see you next Tuesday for episode 2.